By the late 1950s, a strange white delta-winged aircraft had become the single most visible symbol of Britain's nuclear ambitions. The Avro Vulcan, with its enormous triangular wing and cavernous bomb bay, was not designed to look beautiful. It was designed to fly higher, faster, and further than anything the Soviet Union could intercept, carrying a single payload capable of erasing a city. Alongside its siblings, the Handley Page Victor and the Vickers Valiant, the Vulcan formed what became known as the V-Force, Britain's independent nuclear deterrent, and for over a decade, the single most important instrument of British strategic power. 99 Vulcans were eventually built across two variants, the B-1 and the more advanced B-2, and at the height of the Cold War, a portion of that fleet sat permanently at 15 minutes readiness, crews sleeping in flight suits beside their aircraft, prepared to be airborne before a single Soviet missile could reach British soil. The aircraft itself represented an extraordinary engineering gamble. Its delta wing, a configuration barely proven at the time of its design, gave it a combination of altitude performance and range that no contemporary bomber could match. It could reach heights above 55,000 feet, well beyond the operational ceiling of most interceptor aircraft of the era, and its four Rolls-Royce Olympus engines gave it a distinctive, thunderous roar that became instantly recognizable at British airshows for the following 3 decades. But an aircraft built to fulfill one singular, terrifying purpose, delivering Britain's nuclear deterrent through Soviet airspace, was always going to be vulnerable to the moment that purpose disappeared. And that moment arrived far sooner than anyone in 1956, when the Vulcan first entered service, could have anticipated. The Vulcan's entire operational doctrine rested on a single assumption, that a British bomber, flying at high altitude, could penetrate Soviet airspace faster than Soviet defenses could stop it. That assumption collapsed on May 1, 1960, when a Soviet surface-to-air missile shot down an American U-2 spy plane flying at over 70,000 feet, an altitude previously considered safely beyond the reach of any anti-aircraft system in existence. If a missile could reach a U-2, it could certainly reach a Vulcan. Almost overnight, the entire premise of high-altitude nuclear delivery was rendered obsolete, and the V-Force found itself flying an operational profile that no longer made strategic sense. The response was a dramatic and costly shift. Throughout the early 1960s, the Vulcan fleet was retrained and reconfigured for low-altitude penetration, flying missions at heights as low as 100 feet above the ground to slip beneath Soviet radar coverage rather than above Soviet missile range. This transition placed enormous structural strain on airframes that had never been designed for sustained, low-level flight, accelerating metal fatigue in ways that would shorten the operational life of the entire fleet by years. Then, in 1969, a second and far more consequential decision arrived. Responsibility for Britain's independent nuclear deterrent was formally transferred from the Royal Air Force's V-Force to the Royal Navy's Polaris submarine fleet. In a single policy shift, the aircraft that had defined British nuclear strategy for over a decade was rendered strategically redundant. Its central mission handed permanently to vessels hidden beneath the ocean rather than aircraft visible on a runway. Stripped of its original nuclear role, the Vulcan fleet did not disappear immediately. Instead, it entered a prolonged period of reduced relevance, retained by the Royal Air Force in a conventional bombing capacity that the aircraft had never been optimized for, and that few strategists considered a priority. Squadrons were progressively disbanded throughout the 1970s, airframes withdrawn to storage, and defense budget reviews repeatedly identified the Vulcan as an obvious candidate for early retirement. By 1979, only a handful of operational squadrons remained, flying an aircraft that increasingly felt like a relic of a strategic doctrine the world had already moved beyond. Defense planners in Whitehall drafted retirement schedules years in advance, and the general expectation, both inside and outside the Royal Air Force, was that the last Vulcan would be quietly withdrawn from service by the early 1980s, without any particular fanfare. That expectation was interrupted, briefly and unexpectedly, by a conflict 8,000 miles from British shores. In April 1982, Argentina's invasion of the Falkland Islands created an urgent operational requirement that the aging Vulcan fleet, against all prior planning, found itself uniquely positioned to fulfill. Operation Black Buck, a series of long-range bombing raids against Argentine positions on the Falklands, required aircraft capable of flying roughly 8,000 miles round-trip from Ascension Island, a mission profile that pushed both aircraft and aircrew to the absolute limit of endurance, requiring an extraordinarily complex sequence of in-flight refueling involving multiple Victor tanker aircraft. The Vulcan, an aircraft that had spent the previous decade drifting toward irrelevance, briefly became the centerpiece of the longest bombing raids in aviation history at that time, a final, unplanned moment of operational significance for an aircraft type that had already been informally written off by its own service. If the story of aircraft caught between obsolescence and unexpected relevance interests the viewer, the channel invites a subscription. Every week, this series traces the fate of the machines that shaped the outcome of major 20th century conflicts. Operation Black Buck bought the Vulcan fleet a brief reprieve in public attention, but it did not alter the underlying budgetary and strategic logic that had already condemned the aircraft to retirement. Within 18 months of the Falklands conflict, the Royal Air Force proceeded with the disposal schedule that had been drafted years earlier. The Vulcan's official retirement from frontline squadron service came in 1984, though a small number of airframes were retained briefly afterward in a specialized air-to-air refueling role, itself phased out shortly thereafter as newer tanker aircraft entered service. By the end of 1984, the type that had once represented the pinnacle of British strategic air power had been formally withdrawn from operational duty entirely. What followed was a disposal process markedly different from the systematic scrapping campaigns that had consumed Britain's Lancaster bomber, Fleet 4 decades earlier, but no less thorough in its ultimate result. Most retired Vulcans were flown to designated storage and disposal units, primarily at RAF Marham and RAF Saint-Othon, where the majority were broken down for scrap metal. Airframes that had once carried Britain's nuclear deterrent across the Atlantic were reduced, within a matter of months, to sections of aluminum sold for recycling. A small number were preserved as static museum exhibits or gate guardians outside RAF stations, their engines removed and their cockpits sealed, transformed from operational aircraft into inert monuments. Of the 99 Vulcans originally built, the overwhelming majority followed this path. Brief operational careers followed by disposal, leaving only scattered static survivors across Britain and a handful of overseas locations. One airframe, however, followed an entirely different trajectory. Vulcan X-H558, the very last Vulcan to leave the Avro production line at Woodford, had been retained by the Royal Air Force for display duties after its frontline retirement, flying as part of the Vulcan display flight through the late 1980s and early 1990s. When the Royal Air Force finally withdrew XH-558 from flying status in 1993, it appeared destined for the same fate as its sister aircraft, permanent grounding, followed eventually by museum storage or disposal. Instead, a small and determined group of enthusiasts, engineers, and former RAF personnel began an extraordinarily ambitious campaign to keep the aircraft flying in private hands. A project that would take 14 years, tens of millions of pounds in fundraising, and a level of engineering persistence that few observers believed was realistic. The Vulcan to the Sky Trust, formed specifically to pursue this goal, faced obstacles that would have ended most preservation projects within their first year. Spare parts for an aircraft type retired from military service for over a decade had to be sourced from museums, scrapyards, and private collections around the world. Engineers with direct experience maintaining Olympus engines and Delta Wing airframes had, in many cases, themselves retired from the aerospace industry years earlier and had to be persuaded to return to specialized, painstaking restoration work. Airworthiness certification for a Cold War-era strategic bomber, never designed with civilian safety regulations in mind, required years of documentation, testing, and negotiation with British aviation authorities who had no established precedent for certifying an aircraft of this type and history. Despite all of this, on October 18, 2007, Avro Vulcan took to the air again, becoming the only Vulcan bomber flying anywhere in the world, and drawing crowds to British airshows that had not gathered in comparable numbers for any single aircraft in decades. Avro Vulcan's return to flight became one of the most celebrated aviation preservation stories of the early 21st century, but the underlying economics that had made the aircraft's restoration so difficult never disappeared. Operating a 60-year-old, four-engine strategic bomber required specialized engineering support, increasingly scarce spare parts, and fuel and maintenance costs that dwarfed those of virtually any other airworthy warbird in Britain. The Vulcan to the Sky Trust relied heavily on public donations and sponsorship to sustain flying operations, and by 2013, engineering assessments concluded that the aircraft's structural life, combined with the near impossibility of sourcing further critical spare parts, meant that continued flight beyond 2015 would no longer be feasible or safely certifiable. On October 28, 2015, Avro Vulcan flew its final display flight, a farewell tour across British airfields that drew some of the largest crowds in British airshow history, before landing permanently at Doncaster Sheffield Airport, where it remains today as a static exhibit and educational center operated by a dedicated preservation charity. Unlike the Lancaster's disposal, which had been driven almost entirely by post-war economic necessity and bureaucratic indifference, the Vulcan's fate was shaped by a Cold War strategic obsolescence that arrived with unusual speed, followed by a decade-long private rescue effort that succeeded against considerable odds, and finally ended not through scrapping or neglect, but through the simple, unavoidable limits of an aging airframe's structural life. What survives today is not a fleet, but a single, meticulously preserved example, a reminder of what an entire squadron once represented, maintained not by government policy, but by the sustained determination of people who refused to let the type disappear entirely. The moral weight carried by the Vulcan is different in character from that of a bomber that flew hundreds of wartime combat missions. The Vulcan's defining purpose was deterrence rather than direct destruction. Its bomb bay, designed to carry Britain's nuclear arsenal, was never used to deliver that payload in anger. Its only combat use, during Operation Black Buck, involved conventional rather than nuclear ordnance, deployed in a conflict fought over a small group of islands in the South Atlantic. Yet the aircraft's entire design and strategic purpose remained inseparable from its role as an instrument of nuclear deterrence, a machine built specifically to make the unthinkable credible enough to prevent it from happening. Standing beneath Avro Vulcan's enormous delta wing at Doncaster today, a visitor confronts an unusual kind of historical object, an aircraft whose primary purpose was, by design, to never be used, and which succeeded in that purpose for the entirety of its operational life. Its retirement was not a story of failure or destruction, but of a strategic role quietly transferred elsewhere, followed by nearly 3 decades of obsolescence, a remarkable act of private preservation, and a final, dignified grounding. The 4 Olympus engines that once powered Britain's most visible nuclear deterrent will not fly again. But for a brief window between 2007 and 2015, a small group of engineers proved that even an aircraft written off by its own government could be persuaded, however briefly, to return to the sky it was built to dominate. Viewers interested in this story of Cold War aircraft and the fate of Britain's strategic bomber fleets are directed to a related story. What became of the thousands of Lancaster bombers scrapped within a decade of the Second World War's end? Thanks for watching.